world today supports a human population of well over 4,000 million. To feed this enormous population, food must be produced in all parts of the globe, some for subsistence and some as a surplus for trading across the world. Wheat from the prairies of Canada, beef from the vast stockyards of the American Middle West, rice from the paddy fields of the East. Foods from Asia and America, from Australia and Africa, are bought and sold throughout the world. All this is reliant upon the world's farmers producing the necessary foodstuffs to feed an ever-growing population. Agriculture and the production of food for consumption and sale is the result of a revolution which began about 10,000 years ago, a short time in the long span of human history. The transition from a hunting and gathering way of life to settled farming communities was one of the most decisive transformations in human history. It is called the agricultural revolution. Without this agricultural revolution and the increased supply of foodstuffs it made available, the human population could never have grown from the tiny societies of early men and women to today's millions. Modern agriculture, despite all its technology and mechanization, is still, in principle, the same as it has always been. The soil is prepared and the seed is planted. The growing crop is tended until ripe, when it is harvested, and then the soil is prepared again for the next seeding. The harvest is the culmination of the agricultural year, when the fruits of the year's labor are collected in. A modern combine harvester can harvest up to 5 acres of wheat an hour, each acre yielding up to 4 tons of grain. Such productivity would have been beyond the wildest dreams of the early farmers. But today's farmers are the descendants of these first cultivators of the soil, and modern agriculture is the end product of a process which began some 8,000 years before Christ. Without the development of agriculture and the cultivation of the soil, modern urban and industrial society would not have been possible. And as population increased, so has the output of the world's farmers to meet the new demand for food. The availability of an enormous range of foodstuffs on the shelves of the local shop or supermarket is something we take for granted today. Fresh fruit all the year round. Pre-packaged meats and dairy products. Processed vegetables from around the world. Canned foods. Food that is prepared in a variety of different ways from a host of different plants and animals from across the globe. All this supplies the food in our kitchens, the food on our tables, the food that we eat. This is the end result of modern agriculture and the revolution which began some 10,000 years ago. Looking back from the perspective of the 20th century, we can summon up images of primitive men and women. They were hunters and gatherers. They lived by hunting and fishing and foraged for their food, gathering nuts and fruits and scratching with crude stone implements among the roots. The origins or causes of the agricultural revolution are mysterious, but certainly the beginnings of agriculture seem to be connected with climatic changes. And today, where climatic conditions make agriculture impossible, a few people still rely on hunting and fishing and gathering for their livelihood. Eskimos in the frozen Arctic, Indian groups in parts of the Amazon jungle, Bushmen in Africa, and Aborigines in Australia. About 10,000 years ago, things began to change. First of all, in the Near East, on the edge of the mountain ranges between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf. In this region, wheat and barley grew wild. Now, instead of gathering the wild heads of wheat, men and women began to cultivate them. The first farming villages grew up between 8,000 and 7,000 BC, on the edge of the upland zone where there was enough rainfall to sustain agriculture. It was around these mountain villages that cereal cultivation first began. Einkorn, emmer. It seems that they were the most common forms of early wheat. The selection and breeding of the best strains of plants was a crucial aspect of the agricultural revolution. As a result of genetic changes and the domestication of wild cereals by early farmers, higher yields became possible. The varieties of wheat grown today are the result of centuries of domestication and selection. The early farmers would select the best strains and plant the seed, as in these modern drawings. They would tend the plants during the growing season, harvest the crop when it was ripe, and then turn it into food or store it until it was needed. Then they would prepare the ground for the seed to be planted the next year. In essence, these are the principles of farming, and the annual cycle of the agricultural year is the same today as it was for the first farmers. All this was the beginning of cereal cultivation. Bread, we say, is the staff of life. But wheat is only one of the many wild plants which was domesticated and cultivated. In China and much of Asia, rice is a staple food. An equally important crop is maize, or corn as it is now often called. Maize was first cultivated thousands of years ago by the native inhabitants of modern Mexico. It was so important to them that they regarded it as sacred. Chalchutlique was a fertility goddess associated with the growing of maize. The potato, easily grown in many different parts of the world, has now become a staple element of our diet. The potato, along with maize, is the great contribution of the Americas to our basic food today. Originating in Peru, potatoes were first brought to Europe by the Spaniards in the 16th century. The introduction of farming began independently in different parts of the world and spread slowly. Its advance is still continuing today, where new lands are brought under cultivation. In Europe, agriculture spread out gradually from its home in the Near East, along the coast of the Mediterranean, and up the river valleys into Central and Western Europe. Advancing at an average rate of only a mile a year, agriculture finally reached the British Isles about 6,000 years ago, spreading into Russia some 1,000 years or so later. Inaccessible mountains and highland areas were left untouched by the advance of agriculture. The existence of the first European farming villages is often impossible to see on the ground today, but aerial photographs using infrared techniques can just pick out behind the patterns of today's farms the dim outline of these early agricultural settlements, like this one called Semussac, and this one at Saint-Maurice-de-l'Ancard in France. The first European farmers worked the soil beyond these early enclosures. As agriculture spread, the economies of the world developed a marked zonal pattern. Hunting economies survived at both the northern and southern extremes. In the temperate zones, developing alongside the domestication of plants was the domestication of animals. The cereal cultivators found it inconvenient both to grow and hunt, and so animals for food came to be herded near the farming villages. A variety of animals were domesticated in different parts of the world. Goats, sheep, cattle, pigs. At a much later date, the camel, the donkey, and the horse were domesticated by the hunter-gatherer groups, or by farmers of the marginal lands between the arid and the fertile belts. Man's effect on the animal world was as dramatic as his role in developing new plant species. Today, it does not seem unusual for millions of animals to be bred, fattened, and slaughtered for human consumption. But 10,000 years ago, the ancestors of cattle, sheep, pigs, and other animals were not domesticated by man, but were running wild through the forests and over the plains. Only occasionally is it possible today to find relatively primitive forms of livestock that give an idea of how domestic animals would have appeared before man's intervention, like these Soay sheep. Or these pigs from Neolithic times. Or these black rams. Or these highland cattle. As agriculture spread into the arid zones where climate and soil were not suitable for extensive crop cultivation, new forms of animal keeping were developed. This new farming was called pastoralism and was characteristic of the dry zones of North Africa, Northern America, and Central Asia from about 3000 BC. The pastoral revolution was every bit as important a stage in human history as the agricultural revolution. Many of the pastoralists were highly mobile, as in the vast open landscapes of the arid belt that runs across Asia and Africa, separating the temperate zone of the north from the tropical forests of the equator. Away from the great river valleys, life depended upon mobility to take advantage of scattered seasonal pastures. These nomadic pastoralists followed their flocks hundreds of miles in the quest for grazing lands, often living in tents, as some of them, like the Bedouin moving across the deserts of Arabia, still do today. With the domestication of plants and animals, the dimensions of human life completely changed. The result overall was that an increasing number of men settled down with their families in one place. The migratory life of these hunters following their prey gave way to a sedentary life. Sheep, pigs, cattle were penned in on permanent pastures or patches of ground close to their settlements. Once agriculture began, people were tied to the land in a way they had not been previously. So agriculture led to a more settled existence, and in time to the beginning of village life. The spread of farming gave rise to scattered village communities, which still prevail today in many parts of the world. It is often thought that the Near East saw the dawn of the agricultural revolution. It was in the upland zones that the wild ancestors of wheat and barley had grown. The cultivation of these crops soon spread down into the plains, where early farming villages developed. Eventually, agriculture spread into the more fertile valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, great rivers cutting across the arid Syrian desert. On the banks of these rivers today are found the remains of the first urban settlements, like this one at Ashur. But as the area of cultivation spread, new problems arose. Most important of all, the supply of water had to be controlled. Initially, this involved making the most of the sparse rainfall. This led to the introduction of irrigation, the making of trenches and ditches to divert water into the fields. In the great valleys, the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Nile in Egypt, the Yellow River in China, the problem was different. All these rivers were fed by seasonal snowmelt or monsoonal rain, with torrential floods breaking the riverbanks and spreading across the flat, open country. Here, the problem was how to retain the floodwaters to nurture the crops during the hot, dry summer. Elaborate methods were developed over the years to regulate the supply of water. In Egypt today, traditional methods of irrigation are still to be found alongside more modern techniques of dam building and flood control. Agriculture had a profound impact upon human history. The new supplies of food from the cultivation of crops mark out the early farming communities from the hunting, gathering societies which had preceded them. In a hunting and gathering economy, it takes thousands of acres to feed a single family. It's been estimated that in a primitive agricultural economy, it required only 25 acres. The task of solving the problems of cultivation and irrigation led to the emergence of more complex societies. Such problems were beyond the resources of individuals or single families. They called for cooperative effort and could only be solved by organization, as visualized in these modern illustrations. But who was to be in charge of irrigation and other public works? Who would resolve disputes? Very soon there must have been a village headman allocating work and possibly settling arguments over land. Here, no doubt, lie the dim origins of political organization. It was made necessary also by the rapid growth of population which agriculture made possible. People no longer had to live from day to day. Agriculture produced a surplus, which enabled communities to diversify and for skills to develop. As the surplus grew, an increasing variety of plants, figs, dates, and olives, were brought into cultivation. With more abundant food, there came the first great upsurge in human population, which increased something like 16 times between 8,000 and 4,000 BC. Mankind, at last, was on the move. However, human population was still very small 6,000 years ago, merely a few million spread over the whole world. The centers of intensive agriculture were still few and far dispersed. Cities and urban civilization as we know it still lay in the future. But once the agricultural revolution made the use and ownership of land a decisive factor, it inevitably had far-reaching social and political consequences. As early as 10,000 years ago, in a few specially favored places, people were moving from the countryside and scattered village settlements into larger communities. The best known is Jericho in the Jordan Valley, which was surrounded by a stone wall which still survives to a height of over 11 feet. Even more spectacular is Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey, dating from 6000 BC. It covered 32 acres of tightly packed brick and stone buildings. Jericho, Çatalhöyük, and other similar centers were certainly remarkable, considering that the original settlements were built by people who used stone tools and had not yet reached the stage of making pottery. But they were precocious developments. After being inhabited for 1,500 years or more, Çatalhöyük simply disappeared. Jericho and Çatalhöyük were not towns in our modern sense. Rather, they were enlarged villages. However, they were harbingers of a new age, the age of cities and city-states, and eventually of empires. The demands of agriculture and irrigation called for greater cooperation and more ordered communities, and so led to more complex societies. The agricultural revolution had now set the scene for the next phase of human history, the birth of civilization.